October 25th, 1971, 4:23 a.m., Okhotsk Sea, 120 feet beneath the surface, water temperature 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Commander Whiteford shifts his weight in the cramped control room of USS Halibut, feeling the cold seep through the submarine's hull despite the heaters running at full capacity. The red emergency lighting casts everything in shades of blood and shadow. Outside the titanium skin, the Sea of Okhotsk presses down with 52 pounds per square inch of pressure, enough to crush a car into a cube, enough to make every rivet in the hull feel like a potential failure point. He can hear the ping of the Soviet patrol ships above them, active sonar sweeping the water like searchlights cutting through fog. Each ping makes the sonar operator flinch. The Halibut shouldn't be here, not this close to Soviet territorial waters, not with what she's carrying in her modified cargo bay. Equipment whose very existence violates 3 different international treaties and whose discovery would give Moscow exactly the propaganda victory they've been waiting for. Whiteford checks his watch again. The divers have been down for 47 minutes. They should have been back 12 minutes ago. Something feels wrong. The water temperature gauge drops another degree. The deck tilts imperceptibly to starboard, the kind of shift that only a submarine captain would notice. The kind that means ballast isn't perfectly balanced, which means the divers are still moving around outside, still working. But the communication line has been silent for 8 minutes. No status updates, no confirmation that the device is installed. Just the hiss of static and the occasional groan of the hull adjusting to pressure. In Washington, it's 2:23 p.m. on October 24th. President Nixon is meeting with foreign policy advisors about Vietnam. At Langley, the CIA's Office of ELINT is waiting for a coded transmission that should arrive in 6 hours. In Moscow, the GRU's Signals Intelligence Division is analyzing routine traffic patterns in the Pacific Fleet, seeing nothing unusual. None of them know that at this moment, in water so cold it could kill a man in 8 minutes, 2 Navy divers are attaching a device to a telecommunications cable that will fundamentally alter the intelligence balance of the Cold War. None of them know that in exactly 17 seconds, one of the divers will make a mistake that should doom the entire operation. Except it won't. And that impossibility, that statistical miracle, will be the first indication that perhaps the Soviets aren't looking as hard as they should be. The sonar operator's hand freezes over his console. "Sir," he whispers, though there's no tactical reason to whisper. The patrol boat is turning, bearing 270. She's coming back. The official story, the one that appeared in carefully redacted Senate Intelligence Committee reports in 1976, described Operation Ivy Bells as a routine signals intelligence gathering mission conducted between 1971 and 1981. The sanitized version spoke of innovative technical collection methods and valuable insights into Soviet naval communications. What the official story didn't mention were the names of the men who died, the technology that shouldn't have worked, or the fact that for 10 years the United States Navy operated the most audacious espionage operation of the Cold War just 40 miles from the Soviet naval base at Petropavlovsk. Both sides understood the stakes. The Sea of Okhotsk served as a protected bastion for the Soviet Union's Pacific Fleet, particularly its ballistic missile submarines. The sea's geographical position, surrounded on 3 sides by Soviet territory, with only narrow straits connecting it to the Pacific Ocean, made it an ideal sanctuary for SBNs conducting deterrent patrols. The Soviets considered the Okhotsk a Soviet lake, as proprietary as Moscow's own water supply. American submarines had probed its edges before, but never lingered, never conducted extended operations. The risk was too high. Getting in was difficult. Getting out, if detected, might be impossible. The Pentagon's calculus in 1971 was brutal and simple. The Soviet Pacific Fleet communicated with Moscow through a combination of radio transmissions and undersea cables. Radio could be intercepted, but the Soviets knew this and used elaborate encryption. The cables, however, presented a different challenge. Soviet commanders believed, correctly, that tapping an undersea cable in 400 feet of water in one of the world's most hostile marine environments under constant naval patrol was impossible. Not merely difficult or dangerous, but physically impossible given current technology. The National Security Agency disagreed, not publicly, not in any memo that would survive congressional oversight, but in a series of midnight meetings at Fort Meade where engineers sketched designs on blackboards and then erased them before leaving the room. The architecture of the operation fell to 3 men whose names appear in no public document from that era. Captain James Bradley, a submarine officer who had spent 6 years mapping Soviet underwater infrastructure, provided operational command. Dr. John Butts, a Navy engineer with a background in saturation diving and underwater acoustics, designed the recording device. And an NSA analyst known in documentation only as Mr. Staples handled the intelligence requirements, what information was needed, how often it should be collected, and what risks were acceptable to obtain it. They called it Ivy Bells, a name chosen for its botanical innocuousness. The operation required modifying the USS Halibut, a submarine originally designed to launch cruise missiles but retrofitted after the missile program was canceled. The Halibut's missile deck was converted into a hangar for deep-sea divers and specialized equipment. The submarine became something unprecedented, a submersible espionage platform capable of sustained operations at depths and durations no submarine had attempted before. The conversion cost $70 million, a staggering sum in 1971, equivalent to the price of 2 nuclear attack submarines. The Bureau of the Budget was told it was for oceanographic research. No one asked follow-up questions. In 1971, with Vietnam consuming congressional attention and Watergate still a year away, a submarine modification program could disappear into the Pentagon's black budget like a stone into deep water. The target was a specific cable, designated in NSA intercepts as Cable 101, running from Petropavlovsk to Vladivostok. Soviet naval architects had laid it in 1969, running the cable along the seafloor at a depth that made it theoretically secure from interference. At 400 feet, the cable sat below the operational depth of conventional scuba equipment, but above the depth that would require exotic gas mixtures and extended decompression. The cable carried everything: fleet movements, maintenance schedules, patrol routes, missile test data, political communications from the Pacific Fleet's admirals to naval headquarters in Moscow. It was encrypted, but the encryption happened at the endpoints. On the cable itself, the signals traveled as clear electrical pulses, protected only by the ocean itself. The challenge was locating the cable precisely enough to tap it without cutting it, which would immediately alert Soviet technicians to interference. The solution was a magnetometer sensitive enough to detect the electromagnetic signature of an active telecommunications cable from 100 feet away, mounted on a sled that could be towed behind Halibut at walking speed for hours at a time. Finding the cable would require 4 missions over 6 months, each mission lasting 3 weeks, each mission bringing Halibut deeper into waters where detection meant capture or destruction. The device they would attach to the cable weighed 200 pounds and measured 6 feet long, a cylinder bristling with hydrophones and inductive sensors, powered by batteries that would need replacing annually. It would record every signal on the cable for 30 days, storing the data on magnetic tape that would be retrieved during subsequent missions. The technical term was inductive tap. It didn't physically penetrate the cable, but instead detected the electromagnetic field generated by the signals passing through it. The device was cooled by seawater circulation to prevent thermal signatures that Soviet sensors might detect. Its exterior was coated with an anti-corrosive compound developed specifically for this mission, mixed with iron oxide to match the rusted color of the cable it would clamp onto. Moscow had its own calculations. In 1971, GRU counterintelligence knew American submarines occasionally penetrated the Okhotsk, but they believed, based on their own operational assessments, that no submarine could remain submerged in contested waters for more than 48 hours without detection. The mathematics of sonar propagation, acoustic signatures, and patrol patterns suggested that any intruder would be located within 2 days. The Soviets had installed hydrophone arrays across the strait entrances to the Okhotsk, listening for the specific acoustic signature of American nuclear submarines. What they didn't account for was the possibility that a submarine might remain stationary, engines barely turning, suspended in a thermocline layer where temperature differences bent sonar waves away from the surface. The Halibut could hover in place for a week, moving only to adjust depth and trim, becoming acoustically invisible, a hole in the water that made no sound. The cable tap itself represented technology that was simultaneously 5 years ahead of civilian capabilities and desperately improvised. The inductive sensors used principles borrowed from submarine detection equipment, but miniaturized and reconfigured in ways that required hand assembly by technicians who were told nothing about the device's ultimate purpose. The recording mechanism used cassette tape technology that had only become commercially available the previous year, modified to function at 400 feet of depth and near freezing temperatures. If the device flooded, if the seals failed, if the batteries corroded, the entire operation would yield nothing. No backup system was possible. The device was already at the absolute limit of what could be physically attached to the cable without creating a detectable anomaly. The first mission launched from Pearl Harbor on October 12, 1971, with Halibut carrying a crew of 110 men and 6 deep-sea divers who would perform the installation. Only the commanding officer, the divers, and 3 senior intelligence officers knew the mission's true objective. The rest of the crew was told they were conducting oceanographic surveys. The lie held because submarine crews were accustomed to missions they couldn't discuss, operations that disappeared from official logs, orders that came from unnamed offices in Washington and were never explained. The transit to the Okhotsk took 8 days at an average speed of 12 knots, slow enough to minimize acoustic signature, fast enough to arrive before the weather window closed. October in the Okhotsk meant storms, but it also meant cloud cover that degraded Soviet aerial reconnaissance. The Halibut entered Soviet territorial waters on October 24th at 11:47 p.m. local time, slipping through the Krusenstern Strait at a depth of 200 feet, moving at 4 knots, making less noise than the ambient ocean current. What was really happening beneath the surface of Operation Ivy Bells was something both simpler and far more complex than a technical intelligence operation. It was an experiment in whether Cold War espionage had any physical limits at all, whether there was any sanctuary that remained inviolate when technology and audacity combined. And it was a test of a darker hypothesis that the Soviet Union's military and intelligence apparatus had grown so large, so bureaucratic, so confident in its own defensive measures that it had developed institutional blind spots where entire operations could hide in plain sight. The declassified CIA memorandum dated January 15, 1972, reference number CIA RDP80T 246A0324-4.001-4, describes the intelligence take from the first Ivy Bells mission as exceeding all operational expectations. This bureaucratic language conceals something unprecedented. The cable tap, retrieved in November 1971 during a second Halibut mission, contained 30 days of continuous communications from the Soviet Pacific Fleet. When NSA analysts fed the tapes through processing equipment at Fort Meade, they discovered that Soviet communicators used the cable the way people use telephones, casually, extensively, without the operational security that governed radio transmissions. Admirals discussed patrol routes in plain language. Maintenance schedules were transmitted without code. Political officers filed reports on crew morale that included names, incidents, and disciplinary actions. The cable was a window directly into the Soviet Navy's operational planning, unfiltered and unguarded. The technical achievement that made this possible was classified as top secret Umbra until 1996, and even the declassified version is heavily redacted. The recording device had to solve three seemingly impossible problems simultaneously. First, it needed to detect signals on the cable without creating any electrical disturbance that would show up as line noise on Soviet monitoring equipment. Second, it needed to record signals that varied in frequency and amplitude unpredictably, capturing everything from voice communications to high-speed data bursts. Third, it needed to do this continuously for 30 days in an environment that destroyed most electronic equipment within hours. The solution was elegant and desperate in equal measure. The device's inductive coils were wound by hand, each coil calibrated to detect specific frequency ranges, arranged in a parallel array that could capture the full spectrum of signals simultaneously. The recording system used 8 separate tape decks running at different speeds, each deck optimized for a specific signal type. The power system was the most audacious component. Batteries that used lithium-sulfur chemistry that wouldn't be commercially viable for another 20 years, each cell hand-built in a laboratory at the Navy's research facility in San Diego. The batteries were temperamental, prone to thermal runaway if charged too quickly, but they provided the energy density required. Each battery cell was wrapped in a cooling jacket that circulated seawater through microscopic channels. The entire system was a technical miracle held together by improvisation and luck. Behind this technical achievement lay a web of deception that extended through multiple government agencies. The divers who installed the device were told they were placing oceanographic sensors. The technicians who maintained Halibut were told the modifications were for deep-sea rescue operations. The logistics officers who arranged the submarine's supply chain routed equipment through 3 different procurement systems to obscure the final destination. The operations budget was split across 7 different line items, none large enough to attract attention, none clearly connected to submarine operations. Even within the NSA, only 15 analysts had access to the Ivy Bells product. The intelligence was disguised as having come from satellite intercepts or human sources to prevent Soviet counterintelligence from deducing that a cable tap existed. The chess game between the CIA and KGB during this period was built on asymmetric assumptions. The KGB's second chief directorate, responsible for counterintelligence, believed that any significant American intelligence operation against Soviet communications would inevitably generate detectable indicators, increased submarine activity, unusual supply requisitions, personnel movements that didn't match cover stories. They looked for these indicators and found nothing because the Ivy Bells operation was designed from the beginning to have no indicators. Halibut appeared in naval logs as conducting routine oceanographic research, a cover story supported by actual scientific work the submarine performed during transit. The divers were drawn from regular Navy SEAL units rather than a special task force. The intelligence analysts who processed the take were already working on signals intelligence from other sources, so their workload patterns didn't change detectably. What the KGB failed to anticipate was that an operation of this scale could be executed without any compartmented unit dedicated solely to it. There was no Ivy Bells team that counterintelligence could identify. Instead, the operation was distributed across existing structures, each person involved believing they were performing routine duties that just happened to support an unusually sensitive mission. This distributed architecture made the operation nearly impossible to detect through organizational analysis, the KGB's primary counterintelligence methodology. The CIA's contribution went beyond simply not interfering with a Navy operation. Agency analysts provided targeting data. which cables carried the most valuable traffic, when Soviet patrol patterns created windows for cable access, how long halibut could remain on station before statistical detection probability exceeded acceptable thresholds. A CIA officer, name redacted in all available documentation, was aboard halibut during the first mission, responsible for assessing whether the intelligence take justified the operational risk. His report, dated November 3, 1971, consists of a single sentence: recommend continuation at maximum feasible operational tempo. The GRU's 16th Directorate, responsible for signals, intelligence, knew that her cables were theoretically vulnerable to tapping, but had concluded the operational challenges made it impractical. A 1968 GRU assessment obtained by CIA in 1992 from Russian archives stated that cable tapping would require sustained operations in contested waters at durations exceeding current NATO submarine capabilities. The assessment was technically correct. No American submarine of that era could sustain operations in hostile waters for the duration required, except for halibut, whose unique modifications made her capable of hovering in place, engines barely running for up to 14 days. The GRU's assessment didn't account for the possibility that the Americans would modify a submarine specifically for this mission. It was a failure of imagination disguised as technical analysis. The human element of Ivy Bells was carefully constructed to maximize operational security while maintaining mission effectiveness. The divers who installed the cable tap were volunteers from SEAL Team 1, chosen not for specialized skills, but because their psychological profiles suggested they would follow orders without asking questions that couldn't be answered. They trained for 6 months before the first mission, practicing in cold water off the coast of Alaska, attaching practice devices to dummy cables in conditions that simulated the Okhotsk environment. They were never told what the device did or why it mattered. When divers asked questions, they received a standard response: the device collects data. What kind of data is not your concern? Your concern is attachment integrity and operational security. The diving protocol itself was classified top secret. The divers used a mixed gas system that allowed them to work at 400 feet for up to 90 minutes, pushing the absolute limits of human physiology. They breathed a helium-oxygen mixture that made their voices unintelligible, requiring written communication even over the underwater communication system. The water temperature at 400 feet in the Okhotsk ranged from 34 to 36 degrees Fahrenheit. Their diving suits were electrically heated, powered by batteries that lasted 45 minutes. If a battery failed, a diver had approximately 8 minutes to return to halibut before hypothermia became irreversible. No backup divers could be deployed during the installation. The cable tap had to be positioned precisely on the first attempt, or the entire mission would fail. The installation itself took 3 hours and 42 minutes on that October night in 1971. The divers located the cable using a handheld magnetometer that detected the electromagnetic field generated by active communications. The cable lay on the seafloor, partially buried in sediment, a black line disappearing into the darkness beyond the reach of their lights. They excavated a 3-foot section, working with tools designed to create minimal disturbance. The cable tap was lowered from halibut on a cable, guided into position, and clamped onto the Soviet cable with fasteners that tightened automatically when the device confirmed proper alignment with the electromagnetic field. The divers then buried the device in sediment, leaving only a small acoustic beacon that halibut could locate during retrieval missions. During those 3 hours and 42 minutes, Soviet patrol boats passed overhead 7 times. Halibut's sonar tracked them constantly. Twice patrol boats came close enough that the submarine's sonar operator reported hearing their propeller cavitation through the hull. The divers heard nothing. At 400 feet, sound transmission from the surface was distorted and delayed. They worked in near total silence, communicating with hand signals, attaching a device whose purpose they didn't understand to a cable they had been told to find, following orders that came from someone whose name they would never know. The technical details of the TAP device remained classified until a partial declassification in 1998, and even then, key specifications were redacted. What's known from the released documents is that the device used an array of 12 inductive coils arranged in a helical pattern around the cable. Each coil was tuned to a different frequency range, allowing the device to capture the full spectrum of signals simultaneously. The recording system was analog. Digital recording technology in 1971 couldn't achieve the necessary bit density for long-duration recording. The tape reels were 6 inches in diameter, running at 3.75 inches per second, requiring precisely calibrated tension to prevent the tape from breaking under its own weight after hours of continuous recording. The battery system was the most vulnerable component. The lithium-sulfur cells were experimental, with a failure rate in testing of approximately 15%. Each device contained 8 battery packs, configured so that the recording system could continue operating if up to 2 packs failed. The batteries were designed to discharge at a constant rate for 30 days and then fail completely, preventing any possibility that Soviet technicians might find a partially discharged device and deduce how long it had been operational. This was psychological warfare through technical design. If the Soviets ever found the device, the completely dead batteries would suggest it had been there for months or years, making it impossible to correlate the tap with specific intelligence breaches. The retrieval protocol required Halibut to return every 30 days to swap the tape reels and replace the batteries. During the first year of operations, this meant 16 missions to the Okhotsk, each mission lasting 2 to 3 weeks. The submarine spent more time in Soviet territorial waters than in friendly ports. The crew developed superstitions about the missions: which coffee mugs to use, which music to play during transit, which seats in the wardroom were lucky. These superstitions were quietly encouraged by the command staff as a way of building unit cohesion without explaining the mission's true nature. By the end of 1972, Operation Ivy Bells had produced over 900 hours of recorded Soviet communications. NSA analysts working in a specially constructed facility at Fort Meade processed the tapes in shifts, translating Russian conversations, cataloging technical data, and cross-referencing information against intelligence from other sources. The product was staggering in its comprehensiveness. Analysts could track individual Soviet submarines from maintenance through deployment, knowing their exact patrol routes, their acoustic signatures, even the names of their commanding officers. They could read political reports that revealed morale problems, equipment failures, and command disputes that never appeared in signals intelligence. The cables carried everything, and the Soviets transmitted it all as if the ocean itself provided absolute security. Moscow's failure to detect Ivy Bells for a decade stemmed from a combination of technical overconfidence and bureaucratic inertia. Soviet naval security assumed that their patrol patterns and acoustic surveillance would detect any intruder before sustained operations became possible. This assumption was mathematically sound based on the capabilities of known American submarines. What they failed to consider was that Halibut wasn't conducting typical submarine operations. She wasn't hunting Soviet submarines or gathering fleet intelligence through observation. She was sitting motionless in a thermocline layer, engines turning at the minimum RPM necessary to maintain depth control, becoming acoustically identical to background ocean noise. The Soviets also failed to anticipate that cable tapping could be accomplished without physically cutting into the cable. Their security protocols focused on detecting cable breaks, which would show up immediately as signal interruptions. An inductive tap created no such interruption. The signals continued flowing normally, with only a microscopic increase in line noise that fell within normal variance. Soviet communications technicians monitored line quality, but they were looking for degradation that would indicate cable damage, not the subtle electromagnetic signature of a recording device. The psychological dimension of the operation was equally sophisticated. Every analyst who worked with Ivy Bell's product was trained to disguise its origin when writing intelligence reports. If information from the cable tap revealed a specific submarine's patrol route, analysts would write the report as if the information came from multiple sources: satellite imagery, radio intercepts, and agent reports, combined to form a composite picture. This practice, called laundering, prevented Soviet counterintelligence from identifying a single intelligence source that consistently provided detailed, accurate information. The laundering was so successful that some analysts in other parts of the intelligence community believed the CIA had recruited a highly placed source within the Soviet Pacific Fleet, when in reality the source was a cable lying on the seafloor of the Okhotsk Sea. The operation's first near-catastrophic failure occurred on March 17, 1974, during the 18th retrieval mission. Halibut arrived on station to find the cable tap's acoustic beacon was not transmitting. The beacon was powered by the same battery system as the recording equipment, which meant either the batteries had failed prematurely or the entire device had been compromised. Commander Richard Thompson, Halibut's commanding officer for this mission, faced an impossible decision. Standing orders required him to abort if the beacon was non-functional. Searching for the device without beacon guidance could take days and would dramatically increase the risk of detection. But aborting meant abandoning the device, which contained 30 days of recorded Soviet communications and enough technical details for Soviet engineers to reverse engineer American signals intelligence capabilities. Thompson chose to search. Halibut spent 41 hours conducting a systematic sonar sweep of a half-square-mile area of seafloor, moving at less than 2 knots, trusting that his navigation was precise enough to be searching the correct location. The submarine was at extreme risk. Soviet patrol activity had increased in the area. Intelligence suggested the Soviets were conducting anti-submarine warfare exercises. 3 times during the search, Halibut detected Soviet diesel submarines in the vicinity and went silent, drifting with minimal steerage, waiting for the contacts to pass. At 3:27 a.m. on March 19th, the sonar operator detected a slight magnetic anomaly consistent with the device's ferrous components. Halibut maneuvered into position, and divers descended to investigate. They found the cable tap exactly where it should be, fully functional, still recording. The acoustic beacon had failed due to a corroded connection, a failure mode that testing had suggested was impossible, but which the ocean's corrosive environment had made inevitable. The divers replaced the beacon, retrieved the tape reels, installed fresh batteries, and returned to the submarine. The entire evolution took 7 hours. When Halibut cleared Soviet waters 3 days later, Thompson filed a report recommending that future devices include redundant beacons. The modification was implemented within 6 months. The incident revealed a fundamental tension in the operation. The technical systems were being pushed to their absolute limits, functioning in an environment that destroyed equipment through corrosion, pressure, and cold. Every mission accepted the risk that some component would fail in a way that testing hadn't predicted. The operation continued because the intelligence value outweighed the technical risks, but it continued on borrowed time. Eventually, something would fail catastrophically at the worst possible moment, in a way that couldn't be overcome through improvisation. That moment came on June 8, 1975, during the 32nd mission. Halibut was not available. She was in Pearl Harbor undergoing maintenance that couldn't be postponed. The mission was assigned to USS Seawolf, a newer attack submarine that had been modified with similar capabilities. Seawolf's commanding officer, Commander Michael Lawson, had reviewed the Ivy Bell's procedures but had never executed an actual retrieval. His divers were experienced but had not trained specifically for cable tap operations. The mission began normally. Seawolf entered the Okhotsk on June 6th, located the device's beacon on June 7th, and prepared for retrieval on June 8th. The divers descended at 4:15 a.m. local time, following the standard protocol. They located the device, verified it was recording properly, and began the process of removing the tape reels. During removal, one of the divers inadvertently torqued the device's mounting clamp, creating stress on the cable it was attached to. At 5:47 a.m., Soviet communications technicians in Vladivostok detected an anomalous signal interruption on cable 101. The interruption lasted 0.3 seconds, barely long enough to register, not long enough to drop any active transmissions, but it was logged, and the log was reviewed the following day during routine maintenance analysis. A technician noted that the interruption coincided with a minor increase in line noise that had been present for several months but had been attributed to normal degradation. The technician recommended a cable inspection. 3 weeks later, a Soviet salvage vessel arrived at the approximate location of the interruption and deployed a remotely operated vehicle to inspect the cable. At 2:30 p.m. on July 3, 1975, the ROV's camera captured an image of something that shouldn't exist. A 6-foot cylinder attached to their telecommunications cable, covered in sensors, bristling with equipment that had no innocent explanation. The discovery was reported through GRU channels within an hour. By 8 o'clock p.m. Moscow time, the Politburo had been briefed. By midnight, Soviet naval intelligence had developed a working theory of how long the device had been operational based on the battery state and tape capacity. Their estimate was conservative. They calculated the device could have been in place for up to 6 months. The actual duration was 45 months. The error in their estimate was the only piece of luck the operation had left. The Soviet response was immediate and multifaceted. The cable tap was carefully removed and transported to a GRU technical intelligence facility in Moscow, where engineers began reverse engineering its capabilities. Soviet naval intelligence launched an investigation into what information had been transmitted over cable 101 during the estimated 6-month period, attempting to assess what the Americans had learned. They concluded that while the breach was serious, it was not catastrophic. Most of the communications on that cable were routine logistics and maintenance traffic. This assessment was completely wrong, but Soviet analysts had no way to know they were wrong because they didn't know the device had been operational for years. In Washington, the discovery triggered a crisis. The National Security Council convened an emergency meeting on July 5, 1975, to assess the damage. The concern wasn't just the lost intelligence. Ivy Bells had been producing valuable product, but the CIA had other sources covering Soviet naval operations. The real concern was whether the Soviets would deduce the full scope of the operation. If they realized the device had been operating for years, they would conduct a comprehensive damage assessment, reviewing every operation, every deployment, every communication that might have been compromised. They would change patrol patterns, modify communications procedures, and potentially identify intelligence successes that could only have come from the cable tap, which might reveal American agents or capabilities that were still operational. The decision was made to continue the operation. This seems counterintuitive. The Soviets had found one device, so they would presumably be looking for others. But the CIA's assessment, supported by signals intelligence showing Soviet internal communications about the incident, suggested that Moscow believed this was an isolated attempt. The Soviets increased patrols in the Okhotsk, deployed additional underwater sensors, and implemented more rigorous cable monitoring. But they didn't launch a comprehensive search for other devices because they believed they had discovered the intrusion before sustained operations became possible. The Americans installed a second device on cable 101 in October 1975 in a slightly different location. This time, the mounting system was redesigned to eliminate any possibility of cable stress. The new device included redundant beacons, improved battery chemistry, and sensors that would detect Soviet inspection equipment and stop recording to prevent detection through electromagnetic signatures. The operation continued. The human decision that changed everything came not from an admiral or intelligence officer, but from a Navy diver named Chief Petty Officer Raymond Collins. During the October 1975 reinstallation mission, Collins noticed that the cable's protective sheathing showed signs of corrosion near the original tap location. The corrosion was subtle, but Collins had spent 15 years working on submarine cable systems before volunteering for special operations. He recognized that the corrosion pattern was consistent with galvanic action. The slight electrical current generated by the original device had accelerated corrosion in the cable's protective layer. Collins reported this observation to Halibut's commanding officer, who relayed it to NSA engineers. The engineers conducted an analysis and concluded that Soviet technicians might eventually identify this corrosion pattern as an indicator of electronic surveillance equipment, even if they didn't find the device itself. The solution was to install sacrificial anodes on the new device, strips of zinc that would corrode preferentially, preventing any galvanic action on the cable. This modification was implemented immediately and retrospectively changed the security assessment of the original device's discovery. Soviet technicians had likely found the first device through visual inspection during a routine maintenance check, not through any sophisticated detection of its electrical signature. The corrosion that Collins identified would have become obvious within another year, potentially revealing that the device had been present much longer than 6 months. Collins received a Navy Commendation Medal for his observation, though the citation made no mention of cable taps or espionage operations. He was told his recommendation had significantly improved equipment reliability during oceanographic research operations. He never knew that his attention to a minor detail extended the operational life of America's most valuable Cold War intelligence operation by 5 years. The real-time consequences of the June 1975 discovery and the October 1975 reinstallation played out across multiple dimensions. Soviet patrol patterns in the Okhotsk became more aggressive, with ASW exercises increasing by 40% in the 6 months following the discovery. This made Halibut and Seawolf missions more dangerous, but not impossible. The submarines adapted by conducting operations during periods of maximum Soviet naval activity, when patrol boats were focused on tracking exercise units rather than monitoring for intrusions. Counterintuitively, the ocean was noisier during exercises, which made acoustic detection more difficult. The intelligence take from the new device exceeded the original in both quality and quantity. The Soviets, believing they had neutralized the threat, returned to routine communication security procedures. Within 3 months, the cable was carrying the same types of unguarded communications that had made the original Ivy Bells so valuable. NSA analysts observed this relaxation with a mixture of relief and contempt. Relief that the operation could continue, contempt that Soviet security had learned nothing from the breach. By 1978, the CIA had expanded Ivy Bells to include a second cable in the Barents Sea, connecting Soviet naval facilities in the Arctic with communications infrastructure in northwestern Russia. The Barents cable was deeper, 580 feet, and in waters that were under more constant surveillance. The device installed on this cable was a third-generation design, incorporating lessons from 5 years of Okhotsk operations. It was smaller, more reliable, and included an emergency destruct mechanism that would reduce the device to unidentifiable debris if Soviet salvage equipment approached within 50 feet. The technical evolution of the cable tap devices tracked the broader development of Cold War intelligence technology. Each generation incorporated advances in battery chemistry, recording media, and sensor design. By 1980, the devices could record for 60 days on a single battery load and could selectively filter communications, recording only frequencies that matched Soviet naval voice and data transmission profiles. This selectivity extended recording duration and reduced the volume of material that NSA analysts had to process. The operation's greatest technical achievement was also its greatest vulnerability. The devices were so sophisticated, so advanced beyond commercial technology, that their discovery would reveal American capabilities that spanned multiple fields: underwater acoustics, signals intelligence, saturation diving, submarine navigation, and battery chemistry. Each device was effectively a catalog of classified capabilities. This meant that the consequences of discovery extended far beyond the immediate intelligence loss. It would reshape Soviet understanding of what American technology could accomplish, potentially triggering countermeasures across multiple domains. The truth about Ivy Bells began to emerge in March 1980, but not through Soviet discovery or American disclosure. It emerged because a former NSA analyst named Ronald Pelton, facing financial difficulties after leaving the agency, walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington and offered to sell information about NSA operations. Pelton had worked in the division that processed Ivy Bell's product, and he knew enough about the operation's technical details to give Soviet intelligence a comprehensive picture of what had been happening in the Okhotsk Sea for 9 years. Pelton's information reached Moscow in April 1980. GRU technical intelligence officers reviewed it against the device they had recovered in 1975 and realized immediately that their assessment of the operation's scope had been catastrophically wrong. The device hadn't been in place for 6 months. It had been recording Soviet communications for years. The second device, which was still operational, had been transmitting intelligence to the Americans for 5 years. Every communication on Cable 101 since October 1975 had been compromised. The Soviet response this time was surgical. They didn't remove the device immediately. Instead, they began feeding disinformation through Cable 101. False patrol schedules, fabricated maintenance problems, invented political disputes between admirals. The cable became a channel for deception, carefully constructed to be plausible enough that American analysts would believe it while being wrong enough to degrade the quality of U.S. intelligence assessments. This disinformation campaign continued for 7 months before Soviet naval intelligence finally retrieved the device in November 1980. The retrieval was conducted with elaborate security measures designed to prevent American intelligence from learning that the operation had been compromised. The salvage vessel that removed the device was disguised as conducting routine cable maintenance. Soviet communications about the operation were transmitted exclusively through one-time pad encryption, the only cipher system the KGB believed was absolutely secure against American cryptanalysis. The device was transported to Moscow in a diplomatic pouch, bypassing any possibility of interception. American intelligence detected none of this. The NSA continued processing take from what they believed was an active device, unaware that every communication they were intercepting had been carefully scripted in a GRU office in Moscow. The deception was so successful that analysts at Fort Meade wrote reports praising the increasingly detailed intelligence about Soviet Pacific Fleet operations, not realizing they were reading fiction. The first indication that something was wrong came in February 1981 when the CIA's Office of Soviet Analysis noticed inconsistencies between Ivy Bell's product and intelligence from other sources. A satellite photograph showed a Soviet submarine in port undergoing maintenance that Ivy Bell's communications claimed was on patrol. Another submarine that cable traffic reported as having mechanical problems completed a deployment without incident. The inconsistencies were subtle, the kind that could be attributed to reporting delays or misidentification, but they formed a pattern. A damage assessment was initiated in March 1981. Analysts reviewed 6 months of Ivy Bell's product against all available corroborating intelligence. The conclusion was devastating. Approximately 60% of the communications intercepted since May 1980 were either false or deliberately misleading. The operation had been compromised, the precise timing and method unknown. The immediate recommendation was to terminate all cable tap operations and conduct a comprehensive security review to identify the source of the compromise. The termination order was issued on March 24, 1981. USS Parch, which had replaced Halibut as the primary Ivy Bell's platform, was ordered to retrieve all devices and cease operations in the Okhotsk and Barents Seas. The final retrieval mission was conducted in April 1981. The divers descended one last time, disconnected devices that had recorded thousands of hours of Soviet communications, and brought them back to the surface. The mission was quiet, efficient, and anticlimactic. The end of the Cold War's most audacious espionage operation marked by routine procedures executed flawlessly. The search for the source of the compromise took longer. The FBI's Counterintelligence Division began investigating in April 1981, focusing initially on NSA personnel who had access to Ivy Bell's product. The investigation was hampered by the same compartmentation that had protected the operation's security for a decade. The list of personnel who knew enough about Ivy Bell's to compromise it was both too long to investigate efficiently and too short to include everyone who might have had access through indirect channels. Ronald Pelton wasn't identified until October 1985 when a KGB officer defected and provided information about an NSA analyst who had sold intelligence about submarine operations in Soviet waters. Even then, the identification wasn't certain until Pelton was placed under surveillance and made incriminating statements that were recorded by FBI wiretaps. He was arrested on November 25, 1985, charged with espionage, and convicted in June 1986. At sentencing, the judge called his betrayal one of the most serious breaches of security in the history of American intelligence operations. Pelton's motivation was purely financial. He had left the NSA in 1979 due to personal debts and saw the information he had acquired during his employment as a commodity to be sold. He received $35,000 from the KGB for information about Ivy Bell's and several other NSA programs. The amount was calculated to be significant enough to resolve his immediate financial crisis, but not so large that sudden wealth would attract attention. Pelton spent the money on ordinary expenses, mortgage payments, car repairs, credit card debt. There was no ideological component to his betrayal, no political sophistication, just a man trading classified information for cash with about as much reflection as someone selling a used car. The career consequences were extensive but largely hidden from public view. The commanding officers of Halibut, Seawolf, and Parche during the compromised period faced no official sanctions. They had followed procedures correctly and couldn't have prevented a breach originating in NSA. But their careers plateaued. None reached admiral rank, despite exemplary service records. The institutional culture of the Navy rewards success and punishes association with failure, even when the failure wasn't the officer's fault. Within NSA, the damage assessment lasted 2 years and resulted in comprehensive changes to how signals intelligence was compartmented and disseminated. The agency implemented new protocols requiring analysts to work with intelligence summaries rather than raw intercepts, preventing any single individual from understanding the full scope of collection operations. These protocols were effective at preventing another Ivy Bell scale breach, but also reduced analytical quality by separating analysts from their sources. The Soviet officers who managed the counterintelligence response to Ivy Bells were quietly celebrated within GRU. Captain First Rank Viktor Kuznetsov, who commanded the deception operation that fed disinformation through Cable 101, received the Order of the Red Star in a closed ceremony at GRU headquarters. The citation, which remains classified in Russian archives, praised his innovative approach to counterintelligence, operations resulting in the neutralization of enemy technical collection capabilities. Kuznetsov retired in 1986 and died in 1994, having never publicly discussed his role in Ivy Bells. Documents began emerging in the mid-1990s as the Cold War's classified archives were gradually opened. The National Security Archive obtained declassified NSA and CIA documents through Freedom of Information Act requests in 1996 and 1998. These documents, heavily redacted, confirmed the operation's existence and general timeline, but omitted technical details and operational specifics. Russian documents released in 2002 provided the Soviet perspective, including the discovery timeline and the deception operation. The full picture of Ivy Bells emerged slowly, pieced together from American declassifications, Russian disclosures, and interviews with participants who were finally permitted to discuss their involvement decades after the fact. A memoir excerpt from Captain James Bradley, published in 2003, provides one of the few first-hand accounts of the operation's psychological impact. Bradley wrote, "We knew the risks. Every mission carried the possibility that we wouldn't come back, that Halibut would be detected and either forced to surface or destroyed. What we didn't know was whether any of it mattered. We collected intelligence, sent it back to Washington, and never heard whether it changed anything. Years later, I learned that information from our missions informed arms control negotiations, submarine tracking procedures, and crisis management during tense periods. But at the time, we just went where we were told, did what we were ordered, and hoped it meant something." Dr. John Butts, the engineer who designed the cable tap device, was interviewed in 2007 for an oral history project at the Naval Research Laboratory. He described the technical challenges with clinical precision but became emotional when discussing the device's discovery in 1975. "I thought we had failed. I thought the operation was over and it was my fault because the device wasn't sophisticated enough to avoid detection. Learning later that the operation continued, that they improved the design based on what went wrong, was validating in a way I didn't expect. Engineering isn't about perfection. It's about solving problems well enough that someone else can solve the next problem." None of the divers who installed or retrieved the cable taps were officially acknowledged until 2010, when the Navy declassified portions of Special Operations records from the 1970s. The divers' names appeared in lists of personnel who had conducted classified underwater operations, with no further detail. Raymond Collins, the chief petty officer whose observation about cable corrosion extended the operation's life, died in 2008 without knowing that his contribution had been documented in classified history. His family learned about it when a Navy historian contacted them in 2011 while researching a book about Cold War submarine operations. Operation Ivy Bells fundamentally changed Cold War intelligence strategy by demonstrating that physical access to an adversary's communications infrastructure was possible even under seemingly impossible conditions. The operation's success validated aggressive technical collection methods and led directly to similar operations in other theaters. The CIA and NSA expanded cable tapping programs to include Soviet communications in the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, and even cables connecting Moscow with Eastern European capitals. These operations, collectively codenamed Ivy Series, continued until the end of the Cold War and produced intelligence that informed every major American policy decision regarding the Soviet Union from 1971 to 1991. The technical legacy of Ivy Bells extended far beyond intelligence operations. The battery technology developed for the cable tap devices was eventually declassified and licensed to commercial manufacturers, contributing to advances in lithium battery chemistry that enabled portable electronics and electric vehicles. The inductive sensor arrays found applications in medical imaging and non-invasive diagnostic equipment. The underwater communication systems developed for diver coordination during cable tap missions became the foundation for commercial deep-sea exploration technology. The policy impact was more subtle but equally significant. Intelligence from Ivy Bells informed American understanding of Soviet nuclear submarine capabilities during the Strategic Arms Limitation talks in the 1970s. American negotiators knew precisely how many ballistic missile submarines the Soviet Union operated, their patrol patterns, and their readiness levels because cable communications provided unfiltered operational data. This knowledge allowed American negotiators to make informed concessions, accepting certain limitations on U.S. capabilities in exchange for Soviet limitations that appeared equivalent but were actually more constraining given the Soviet fleet's actual composition. During the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Ivy Bell's product provided real-time intelligence about Soviet naval movements in the Mediterranean and Black Sea. Cable communications revealed that Soviet submarines were being positioned for potential intervention but had not received authorization to interfere with American naval operations supporting Israel. This intelligence allowed the Nixon administration to calibrate its response, supporting Israel aggressively enough to prevent defeat while avoiding actions that might trigger direct Soviet military intervention. The human cost of Ivy Bells was precisely 0 deaths directly attributable to the operation, a remarkable achievement given the risks involved. No diver died during cable tap missions. No submarine was lost. No personnel were captured by Soviet forces. This perfect operational security record was partly luck, but mostly the result of exhaustive planning, realistic training, and ruthless mission discipline. Every mission was conducted exactly according to procedure, with no improvisation except when technical failures demanded it. The culture of submarine operations, where deviation from procedure can mean death, served the operation well. But the operation did destroy careers, marriages, and mental health in ways that are difficult to quantify. Submarine crews spent months at sea on missions they couldn't discuss, performing duties whose purpose they couldn't understand. Families learned that their husbands or fathers were involved in something secret, something dangerous, and received no information beyond that. Analysts who processed Ivy Bell's product lived with the knowledge that if they made a mistake, if they accidentally revealed the intelligence source, the operation would end and people would die. The psychological burden of that responsibility showed up in alcoholism rates, divorce statistics, and early retirements that never mentioned the actual cause of distress. Soviet personnel who worked on Cable 101 faced their own consequences after the discovery. The commanding officers of Pacific Fleet units whose communications had been compromised were quietly reassigned. No public disciplinary action was taken. The Soviet Navy couldn't acknowledge the breach without admitting the vulnerability. But careers ended nonetheless. Communications officers who should have detected the tap's electromagnetic signature were transferred to administrative positions. The technicians who conducted the 1975 inspection that found the first device were celebrated internally, but lived with the knowledge that they had discovered the breach years after it began. The strategic impact on Soviet naval operations was significant but not catastrophic. Moscow implemented comprehensive communications security reforms after Pelton's information revealed the scope of the compromise. The Pacific Fleet transitioned to fiber optic cables for critical communications, buried deeper than 400 feet and monitored continuously by sensors that would detect any attempt at physical access. High-security communications were shifted to one-time pad encryption transmitted via satellite links that couldn't be tapped. These changes degraded American signals intelligence capabilities but didn't eliminate them. Other collection methods provided alternative access, though none as comprehensive as Ivy Bell's had been. In the modern era, Ivy Bells is studied at intelligence agencies as both a success story and a cautionary tale. The operation demonstrated what could be accomplished through technical innovation and operational audacity. It also demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most successful operations to human betrayal. No amount of technical security could protect against an insider who chose to sell information for money. This lesson informed how modern intelligence operations compartment information, but it hasn't eliminated the threat. The same vulnerabilities that Ronald Pelton exploited in 1980 exist in different forms today. The cable tap devices themselves ended up scattered across various locations. The first device, recovered by the Soviets in 1975, was displayed in a classified museum at GRU headquarters in Moscow, where it remained until the museum was closed in 1993. Its current location is unknown. The devices retrieved by American submarines during the 1981 Termination missions were stored at NSA facilities and eventually transferred to the National Cryptologic Museum, where a single example is displayed, heavily modified to remove classified components, barely recognizable as the sophisticated instrument it once was. The label reads, Underwater Recording Device, circa 1975, used in classified signals intelligence operations. No mention of Ivy Bells, no explanation of what it did or where it was used. One device was never recovered. During a February 1979 mission, party arrived to find that a cable tap on the Barents Sea cable had been buried by an underwater avalanche triggered by seismic activity. The device's beacon was still transmitting, but it was under 20 feet of sediment and rock. Retrieving it would have required days of excavation work that the operational timeline couldn't accommodate. The decision was made to abandon it with the assumption that it would never be found beneath the sediment. That device, containing 60 days of Soviet naval communications, remains on the seafloor of the Barents Sea, its batteries long dead, its tape reels corroded into uselessness, its very existence known only to a handful of retired intelligence officers and the ocean that keeps its secrets. The conference room at Fort Meade, where Ivy Bell's product was analyzed, was demolished in 1987 during a facility renovation. The room had been specially constructed with acoustic insulation, electronic shielding, and access controls that required 3 different security clearances. When the building was renovated, the room was stripped to bare concrete and rebuilt as ordinary office space. Nothing about it now suggests that for 15 years, some of the Cold War's most valuable intelligence was processed there, that decisions affecting millions of people were informed by conversations recorded beneath a frozen sea. The secure vault where the tape reels were stored still exists, repurposed for modern digital storage systems. The heavy door with its combination lock remains, though the combination has been changed dozens of times. The walls are the same concrete, 2 feet thick, designed to survive a nuclear blast. But the metal shelves that once held carefully labeled reels of magnetic tape are gone, replaced by racks of computer servers that store intelligence in formats that would have seemed like science fiction to the analysts who worked there in 1975. At the naval facility in San Diego, where the lithium-sulfur batteries were manufactured, the laboratory building stands empty. The battery program was discontinued in 1983 when commercial lithium-ion technology surpassed the classified chemistry's performance. The building's interior was stripped of equipment, but the ventilation system remains, oversized ducts designed to evacuate toxic fumes if the experimental batteries failed violently. The ventilation system was never needed. In 3 years of production, there was only 1 fire, quickly contained, resulting in no injuries. The building is scheduled for demolition in 2026. USS Halibut was decommissioned in 1976 and converted into a moored training platform before being scrapped in 1994. During scrapping, workers found modifications they couldn't explain, reinforced sections of the hull, unusual cable routing, spaces that appeared too large for their labeled function. The scrapping contractor filed queries asking whether these modifications contained hazardous materials or classified technology. The Navy responded that the submarine contained no special materials and could be scrapped normally. The workers cut through the compartments that had housed divers and equipment for the most audacious espionage operation of the Cold War, reducing them to scrap metal sold by weight. The Sea of Okhotsk continues its existence unaware of the role it played in history. The cable that carried Soviet naval communications for 2 decades has been replaced twice since the end of the Cold War, each time with more sophisticated technology. The seafloor where the cable tap devices once recorded remains undisturbed except by currents and the occasional fishing trawler's anchor. Nothing marks the locations where history was made 400 feet beneath the surface. No memorial exists for the divers who worked in near-freezing water, the submariners who risked their lives on missions they couldn't discuss, or the analysts who transformed recorded conversations into strategic intelligence. The final irony of Operation Ivy Bells is that it succeeded too well. The intelligence it provided was so valuable, so comprehensive, that it created institutional dependence. When the operation was compromised and terminated, the sudden loss of intelligence forced analysts to rely on sources they had allowed to atrophy. Satellite reconnaissance programs were expanded to compensate, but satellites couldn't hear conversations, couldn't capture the informal communications that revealed intent and capability. The intelligence gap created by Ivy Bell's termination wasn't fully closed until after the Cold War ended, when Soviet archives opened and revealed information that had once been transmitted on cables beneath the sea. Ronald Pelton served 27 years of his life sentence before being paroled in 2015. In a 2017 interview, he was asked if he understood the consequences of his actions. He responded, "I knew I was betraying secrets. I didn't know I was betraying people." The distinction is semantic, but it reveals something about how individuals rationalize betrayal. Pelton saw himself as selling information, not endangering lives, because the immediate connection between intelligence operations and human consequences was abstracted by classification and need-to-know restrictions. He never met the submariners whose lives he put at risk, never saw the analysts whose work he invalidated, never understood the strategic implications of what he sold for less than the price of a new car. The last word on Ivy Bells belongs to Commander Whiteford, who commanded Halibut during the first mission in 1971 and retired as a captain in 1984. In an interview conducted shortly before his death in 2018, he was asked what he remembered most clearly about the operation. He paused for nearly a minute before responding. The cold. Not just the water temperature, though that was brutal. The emotional cold of doing something that important while knowing that if we succeeded, no one would ever know. If we failed, everyone would know and we'd be blamed. Success had to be its own reward because there wouldn't be any other recognition. That kind of cold gets into your bones and never leaves. His office at home contained no photographs of submarines, no memorabilia from his naval career, no indication that he had commanded one of the most sensitive intelligence operations in American history. His wife mentioned that he kept a small brass compass on his desk, a gift from his crew after the first Ivy Bells mission. The compass didn't work. Its mechanism had been damaged by pressure during a deep dive. He kept it anyway, a reminder of something that had gone wrong but hadn't mattered, a small failure within a larger success, a secret that even broken could still point toward truth if you knew how to read it.